Japanese armed forces, particularly their navy, kamikazes and the samurai warriors, and had this bushido belief. They wanted to build an empire.
Let's dig into the World War II battleship archives. Our journey begins today in Dallas, Texas.
Hello, I'm Charles Jones. I'm the owner of a collection of World War II warships for about 18 different navies. And I'm donating it to the new Navy museum that will be under construction. There will be a room there where we use these models, and it'll be called the Charles Jones Education Center. We want people to walk out knowing how important it is for our Navy to keep the trade lanes open because of seas that are free.
Warships of legacy. Pearl Harbor with Charles Jones.
2 different European fleets destroyed by Asian people. And this was unheard of. No one believed. In the Battle of Tsushima, their British battleships were faster than the Russian fleet that's coming up with Admiral Markov. And now they're in a formation where the Japanese are the top of a T and the Russian fleet battleships are in a straight line heading for it. That's called crossing the T. Well, the point of it is the one that's at the top of the T has all broadsides can concentrate, whereas the one coming at them, only the forward batteries can be used. And not only can they only use the front turrets on their battleships, they're having to shoot over their buddies right in front of them. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That was their motto. There was going to be a battleship holiday for at least a decade. You cannot build another battleship, except that the British, once more, said, well, we had to get rid of some battleships, and we want to have 2 more brand new ones, and that turned out to be the Anson and the Rodney. There was so many tonnage of battleships for the United States and for Royal Navy, but the Japanese could only have 70% of that. So you start off, if you're the Japanese, if there's a war between the United States and England against the Japanese, they're already 30% down. And they were furious about that. Why are you telling us that? Well, you see, we have 2 oceans to protect. And the Japanese, you guys are just hanging out here in the Pacific. But again, it's another backhanded diplomatic slap in the face. From 1935 to 1940, everybody is back on the building up your fleet and getting modern battleships. We started it just like everybody else. These South Dakota types, we built 5 of those. We had already built 2 Maryland and North Carolinas, and they were faster than that one, but they all had 16-inch rifles, and they had really good armor plate, and they could get up to almost 30 knots, and they all got the title of fast battleship because it meant that it wasn't 21 knots any longer. They're up to 27, 28 knots. And we're building ours, and everybody else is doing the same thing. The Italians, the French, and now the Japanese are working on some battleships. But they didn't tell anybody that they were going to break the 35,000-ton limit. They're going to double it. And they're going to create these 2 super battleships, and they're going to have 18-inch guns. And that's because they knew they could never outbuild the Americans, so they had to have quality over quantity. And that was the plan. And they executed it. In 1940, the United States pumped 86% of all the oil pumped on the planet. We were what we now think of as Saudi Arabia, and Churchill goes back to London, and Roosevelt comes back to Washington. However, when the cat's away, the mice will play, And this guy named Dean Rusk was in the State Department. He wasn't the Secretary of State, he was down a couple of layers. And what he does is he goes to the banking, the U.S. Treasury, and tells them, you write off the Japanese. They are no longer allowed to send yen to buy the oil. No, you can't do any banking in the United States. That's what they did to them. So no longer can the Imperial Navy buy oil from the United States and have the tankers bring it over to Japan. Well, now all of a sudden they can't do anything because they're not allowed to buy it. And another slap across the face from that, they had just about enough oil to fuel the Imperial Navy up through January, maybe into February. And at that point, they might as well tie it up in the docks because they couldn't go anywhere. They didn't have the oil to do it. Now that will change the Imperial Navy's viewpoint of the United States, and that was kind of the worst thing, that another slap, but this was even worse because they were very proud of that Navy they had. And they practiced things, getting all the airplanes off the decks very quickly, which we couldn't do in the Navy at that point in time. On December the 7th, 1941, at about 6 in the morning, the 6 carriers brought all of their airplanes. They were gonna fly off in 2 waves, the first wave and then the second wave. And about 6 in the morning, they spotted the planes on their decks, and they, unlike the American carriers, would never have gotten all of these planes off that quickly. The first wave had well over 150 or so planes that came in. Their goal was to basically shoot up the fighter bases there in and around Pearl Harbor. At about almost exactly 8 a.m., here they come over the horizon, and they didn't go immediately at the ships. They immediately went to the air bases around there and shot those things up. They even went over to where they knew the Marine soldiers were in Schofield Barracks. They went over there and they shot up those barracks. So that's what the Marines woke up to, was 30 caliber and 20 millimeter from the Zeros just shooting up the buildings that they were sleeping in. They run outside, and the main thing was to limit, if not eliminate, the fighter defense of Pearl Harbor. Here comes the second wave, and the first wave heads back north. And the second wave comes in, and that's where they had taken a battleship shell and put a armor-piercing nose on it. And they did several of these, and they flew over, and one of the bombers dropped one of these armor-piercing, probably 1,000-pound high explosive, and happened to hit the Arizona just to the right of B turret. There's A, B, and XY on the back of ships. That's how they name them. So B would be the superimposed turret, and that's where the bomb went in, and it went all the way down to the magazines and exploded. And all of those high explosives that were down there, gunpowder, there's a special kind of gunpowder they use called cordite, but it boomed like that, and those are the pictures you see in all the movies of this gigantic explosion and this huge volcano of smoke going up to the sky. That's the Arizona, which went down, and hardly a handful of guys survived. One row back is the Oklahoma outside of the Nevada, and the Oklahoma gets 4 or 5 torpedoes on her port side, and she rolls over to the port side and turns over, and only the hull of the bottom of the hull is sticking up in the air. And inside was the Nevada, and in a Kurdish thing, they got up steam and pulled out from inside of the Oklahoma, and they were headed out. They were trying to. They were thinking they would come out of Pearl Harbor and get into the ocean And maybe then they could go out and, in noble glory, trying to find these guys with their one battleship, the Nevada. And at 21 knots, they weren't going to catch anybody.
Let's take a moment of silence for the lives lost at Pearl Harbor and honor all those who served. Veterans, we thank you.
Carriers, that was the only thing they had to fear, because these old battleships weren't going to be a threat to them. There were supposed to be 3 carriers in Pearl Harbor at anchor. They were not there. The carriers were gone. They came down and they didn't realize that they weren't there. That was the big thing. That was the carriers. Get the carriers. Nagumo's said, no, I will tell the Emperor that we have had a successful attack on Pearl Harbor. And that was the message he sent. We had 6 fleet carriers. The Japanese had 6 fleet carriers. And Nagumo said, no, we need to have a balanced attack. We need to have a bigger attack fleet, and we want to have a lot of torpedo bombers and a lot of dive bombers and a lot of Zeros. Everybody thought that it was a Japanese submarine that attacked the Indianapolis and sunk it, which is only partially true, because the submarine didn't fire a torpedo. It let loose one of these Kai-10s, and those things have the back end of this big torpedo that they had, and it goes, I was stunned by this. That darn thing can go 40 knots. And not only does it go 40 knots like it does if it's just a torpedo, but there's a man in it. And a man in it can see where we're going on this thing. So yes, and it was just be an amazing attack. And that's what happened. The Indianapolis bringing that atom bomb was top secret. All that anybody knew was the Indianapolis was going to go up there to Tinian, and they did all that, and they gassed up with fuel oil, and it was going to go back down to Ulithi and rejoin the fleet and get in the fight again. This was a heavy cruiser.
World War II ended not just because of the atom bomb. It ended because the US Navy in the Pacific eradicated the Imperial Navy. They were no longer a threat. They couldn't do anything. Without this victory, we would have been forced to invade Japan, facing immense casualties. The Japanese had a defensive plan involving civilians, strapping explosives to youth to attack American tanks. They had 5,000 more kamikaze planes, thousands of speedboats, and Kai-10s ready to defend. Their resolve was to use every possible means, even at the cost of 29 million lives. This would have been a costly win for us, but the bomb ended the war. The Japanese, without their navy, lacked the fuel and food to continue. They were prepared to fight with their backs to the wall with everything they had.
The ocean should never be locked up by one country. And that has happened in the past, and it'll happen again if we don't have a real navy, a bigger navy, and a more effective navy